Now, you're sitting in your house and your phone pings. It is a message from someone claiming to be living in your house, but not right now, but from the year 1543. Or imagine this: a stranger from future walks into your house and offers you a gift of a gadget that can communicate across time. Would you accept that gift? Or would you reply to that message? This is the dilemma that Ken, Deb, and Thomas, and a few others faced in their lifetimes. This is a true experience of Ken Webster from his book, The Vertical Plane, that came out in 1989. It's a centuries-old mystery where the past, present, and future overlap each other like a vertical plane on a single axis of space, and that space was called Meadow Cottage. It began in the year 1543 in a small tucked-away village called Dodleston in England. Thomas Harden, or Hawarden, was a humble farmer who lived a quiet life in his cottage and lived a life of quiet routine. Now one day he walked into his kitchen and he found his maid, a 14-year-old girl, Catherine, asleep by the fireplace. So he walked up to her and picked her up to take her up to her room when he noticed the chimney glowing green. Thomas is petrified as he watches this green glow increase and intensify, and out of the glow, a man steps out. Thomas is terrified. He now thinks the devil has come into his kitchen to claim his soul. The glowing man assures Thomas that he is not there to harm him, and then he places a mysterious box of light on the kitchen table, and he leaves a message with Thomas and disappears. Still terrified, Thomas wakes Catherine up and points her to the box, but Catherine is unable to see the box. Shaking like a leaf, Thomas spends all night praying to the Lord, but in the morning when he walks back into the kitchen, the box is still there, visible only to his eyes. Now meanwhile, in 1984, in the same Meadow Cottage of Dodleston, are now living a couple called Ken Webster and Deb. Now Ken was an economics teacher at a local high school in Hawarden, and Deb is an artist and an entrepreneur. Now they have just moved in recently and they're having renovations done in the ground floor, and so have this entire floor gutted. In the meanwhile, they also invite their friend Nick to stay with them for a while until she finds her footing in London. Now one evening, Nick notices something strange in the kitchen. Between the wall of the kitchen and the bathroom, there are these peculiar marks that look like small footprints with 6 toes moving from the wall and leading up to the ceiling. "What's this?" Nick asks Ken and Deb. Now Ken and Deb replied that these marks have been there for a while and they have assumed that it was someone from the neighborhood who was pranking them. The next few days they spent some time painting the kitchen walls and the other walls on the ground floor, and they have painted over these peculiar marks in the kitchen. The next day, when Ken wakes up and walks into the kitchen, the marks are back. Now what's more strange is that the marks are not exactly in the same place that they were in before the wall was painted over. They were in a slightly different place, at a different angle. It was as if someone had walked on the dusty floor of the kitchen and then decided to walk across the wall and disappear at the ceiling. Ken, Nick, and Deb are very unsettled by this. After a lot of questions are thrown and no answers are found, they decide that it was a prank again by somebody in the neighborhood, or perhaps one of them had developed a strange sense of sleeplessness. The next day, they go to Chester, the nearest village, to buy some supplies, and they come back late in the evening quite exhausted that they leave all the supplies on the kitchen floor and go off to sleep. The next morning when Ken wakes up and walks into the kitchen again, he notices that these cat tin foods have been stacked into a pyramid by the exposed brick pillar in the kitchen. Deb and Nick assume no responsibility for it, and now they begin to suspect that John, the guitarist, a friend of theirs from the neighborhood, perhaps has been playing some pranks on them. But the thought that someone has been sneaking into their house in the middle of the night and pulling off these pranks seemed a little eerie for them. In spite of everyone trying to show a face of courage, none of them go down into the kitchen or the ground floor in the nights anymore. But strange things continue happening. Another day they found a few bottles of lemonade and a bag of cat food and a kitchen roll stacked into a 4-foot column. So precariously balanced, they decided this was even too good for John. A few times Ken and Deb and Nick get this feeling that there is someone in their room or someone in the house. Now every sound of furniture moving and every creak of the floorboard keeps them awake in the nights now. A couple of days after Thomas received his Liam's boist, which literally translated to glowing box in early modern English, he noticed something strange. Catherine was working by the fireplace and singing a song, and the box glowed up and started showing the verses of her song. After Catherine left, Thomas walked up to the same place and started singing the same song, and sure enough, the box glowed up once more and started showing the verses of that song. Thomas tried various songs and other dialogues and noticed that every time he said something, the words appeared in the box. This time, Thomas decided to talk to the box directly. He walked up to it and asked it, why was it here in his house? The box gave such a strange reply that Thomas was scared witless. He stopped all communication with the box for a couple of days. But that's when strange poltergeist-like activities started happening in Thomas's place too. Objects stacked, paper torn, furniture and other objects moved about in the kitchen. Catherine was horrified by these hauntings. She barely even had the courage to step into the kitchen on days like this. Finally, Thomas decided he had to do something about it. So he walked back up to the Liams again and asked it why does it want to do this to him. Now, on the other side, on the other plane, Nick wanted to write a few plays. Ken suggested that she use a computer for this process and borrowed one, a BBC Microcomputer from his school. For want of space, they placed this computer on the kitchen table pretty much on the same place where Thomas's Liams is in 1543. Was that a coincidence or was it meant to be? I don't know. Nick loved the computer and started writing her sketches in it. Now one evening, after a tea at a friend's place, the three return home and Ken walks into the kitchen and notices that the computer is turned on. And out of curiosity, he turns on the word processor and he notices a new file on the top of the list named KDN. Intrigued by it, Nick clicks on it and this message appears on it.
Ken, Deb, Nick. True are the nightmares of a person that fears. Safe are the bodies of the silent world. Turn, pretty flower, turn towards the sun, for you shall grow and sow. But the flower reaches too high and withers in the burning light. Get out your bricks. Pussycat, pussycat, went to London to seek fame and fortune. Faith must not be lost, for this shall be your redeemer.
Ken, Deb and Nick are left very disturbed. In fact, Nick was so scared that she wanted to leave, but Ken and Deb persuaded her that this was some crazy prank by some hoaxer, probably by John the guitarist, who would often come to their house in the afternoons or evenings to use their 8-track recorder, who also often sometimes jammed with them. And Nick is finally convinced to stay back. But a few days later, they find 4 cans of lager and 4 cans of cat food tin stacked into 2 parallel towers on the kitchen table. What was more alarming about this was that Ken also found black, drawn-out plastic-like threads lying on the table. These are the burnt-out remains of the plastic rings, the carrier rings or ties that the 4-pack lager comes in. The prankster had taken the time to burn the rings after stacking the cans. This was too sinister to be a harmless prank anymore, And the already disturbed Ken, Nick, and Deb are even more unnerved now. They avoid coming downstairs in the night, especially into the kitchen. With Christmas approaching and Nick wanting to stay with her folks for the holidays, it isn't until February that the computer is back in the house again. Now again, one evening after spending a lovely time at the local pub, the Red Lion, the three returned home and Nick suggested that, as a joke, to see if there were any new messages for them. Turns out there was one. Now here is the message. It is written in early modern English, so I have narrated the translated version for you.
I write on behalf of many. I do not understand the strange words you speak, although I must admit I have not been well educated myself. Sometimes I think these changes are rather troubling, for they disturb my sleep at night. You are a good man with an imaginative woman who lives in my house. I do not wish to frighten you, for only since my half-witted antics have torn apart my boundaries have I been troubled at night. I have seen many changes, most recently the charge of the house and your home. It is a suitable place with lights made by the devil and expensive things that only my friend Edmund Gray or the king himself could afford. It was a great crime to have stolen my house. L.W.
The three were shocked by this message. It appears as if LW was claiming that they were living in his house and LW wasn't too pleased about it. At the behest of their solicitor friend John Cummins, Ken decided to reply to the message. He apologized to Lucas for disturbing his peace and asked Lucas when was it that he had lived in his cottage. He also inquired about Edmund Gray and LW's king. By reply, I mean that he just opened up a new Word file and wrote down the message and saved the file to disk. A day or two later, they receive a message from Lucas, again when they were not in the house. And the message was full of inconsistencies.
Edmund Gray, brother of John Gray, lives at Kinnerton Hall. My king of course is Henry VIII, who was 46. L.W. March 28, 1521.
1. In 1521, King Henry VIII was 30, not 46, as LW had claimed. And 2. Ken confided into a friend and a fellow teacher, Peter Trinder, a scholar from Oxford University, who became absolutely fascinated with the messages and the language that LW was sending. Now, Peter finds out that the Kinnerton Hall wouldn't be built until the end of 17th century and that there was no record of an Edmund Gray of having ever lived there. So obviously this whole thing was a hoax. But the question remained that why would anyone play this on them and who was it? After his wife passed away in 1517 along with their unborn son, Thomas had been pretty much living alone. Except for Catherine now, of course. So he had been keeping himself busy with quiet routine and a lot of work. But now his routine and work had gone out of whack because of these peculiar messages he had been receiving on his limbs from someone claiming to be from the period of Queen Elizabeth II. Now Thomas only knew of one Elizabeth, that is the Elizabeth, the daughter of King Henry VIII, who was still young. Now Thomas was also being pulled between his intuition and his fears. On one hand, he felt that the messages were from the people of the future, but on the other hand, he was afraid that it was the devil that was talking to him out of limbs and would one day come to claim his soul. That was the reason why Thomas had been writing his name as L.W. or Lucas Wayneman after his friend and a mentor of the past, rather than reveal his own name. Catherine was also pretty distressed by these hauntings and she was imploring Thomas to stop his unworldly activities with the devil. Finally, Thomas's fears won. Thomas decided that he would mix in some lies with his truth so that if Ken and Deb were really from the future, they would be able to find out the lies that he was telling about himself. So he told them in one of the messages that he graduated from Jesus College of Oxford, which was not true. As more and more messages were exchanged, Ken began to wish that this was not a hoax. The messages from Thomas seemed pretty authentic to him. The latest intrigue for Ken was that Lucas had mentioned that his house was built of redstone and oak. Now, Ken's Meadow Cottage was not built of redstone, but the recent diggings have unearthed redstone foundation in the ground floor. Peter Trinder was also drawn into this mystery of Lucas because he found that several of Lucas's words were authentic to the time that Lucas was claiming to be from. Even though the initial messages were riddled with certain punctuation and grammar and other errors, the later on messages sorted themselves out and pretty much taking on an authentic form. And on further research, he discovered that the language was also much more native to the Cheshire region. By this time, Deb had also begun her own investigations. She was researching along with a friend on the topic of ley lines. Now, ley lines are said to be lines crisscrossing around the earth, and they're said by certain paranormal investigators to be highways of energy that attract or even amplify paranormal or ghostly phenomenon. Deb found that the cottage was on one such ley line, which could be the reason for all of this flutter of activity that was happening in the house right now. The next message added a new twist to the already bizarre story. Thomas was busy in his kitchen and he starts hearing this strange new music. He had heard this before a few times in his house, especially in the kitchen. He knew from the past messages that Ken and Deb were also aspiring musicians and practiced a lot in their house. But this music was getting a little too noisy for him this time. Not just this, there were also other things happening with Thomas in his house. One day he walked into his kitchen to find this strange form of a man by the kitchen table with a strange glowing box. Now Thomas walked in to have a closer look at the person, and the person felt the presence of Thomas and turned around to look. But before their eyes could meet, the man disappeared along with the box. Another day, Thomas saw the vague image of a stunningly beautiful woman playing on a strange wind instrument that was shiny and gold and not at all like the flute of his times. So in the next message, Thomas asked Ken and Deb to kind of keep it down with their music practice because it was disturbing his peace of mind. And he also recommended that Deb use a flute of their time and not that strange instrument that she was playing. Ken and Deb were startled by this message. Was Lucas able to hear and see them all the time in their house? Or was it that a hoaxer was spying on them constantly? Both of the possibilities were kind of frightening for them. Ken decided to put this to test. Ken cut out a picture of a Jaguar car from a car magazine and put it beside the computer and wrote about it to Lucas. Thomas was able to see the picture. He saw the picture of the car and he was quite fascinated and intrigued by it. What was this wood that shone like silk in the cart of the future? And why does this cart not have a horse? How would a cart without a horse go anywhere? So he puts this into his next message, asking them to explain further about this technology. This was proof to Ken and Deb that Thomas was in some way able to hear and see Ken and Deb, at least when they were inside the kitchen. Ken and Deb also noticed that the newspaper cutting was charred along the edges and nearly crumbled in their hands when Ken picked it up. What did that mean? But soon, Thomas decided to stop communicating with them. The poltergeist activities were reaching a peak in his house and it was becoming too much for Catherine to handle it. She was terror-stricken all the time in the house. And Thomas was pretty disappointed that Ken and Deb or even Peter were not able to find out his lies about the Jesus College and other stuff. So Thomas decided to put an end to this.
Pray, what strange demons are you? I'm so confused. You're goodly, I feel, but your lies frighten me much. You said you are alive, but this is not so. If you were alive, you would say you do not know of Jesus College. You said also that you are an educated man, but you do not mention my misspelled words. You also spoke of a power of which I have no knowledge. Where does this power come from? And what did you study in your place of learning? Because if you do not explain this to me, then I must make an end to my words with you. This would cause me much despair. It is not I that make you afraid, it is you that makes me afraid. Lucas.
Ken and Deb became unhappy. Somewhere in their minds, they believed that Thomas was true and they were having a communication across the past. And if anything, this message was proof that Lucas was as real as them. He had just tested to see if they were real. Ken could imagine that if they were quick to jump to the theory of a hoaxer, it was far too easy for a simple man from the 16th century to believe that they were the demons. Ken apologized to Thomas and pleaded with him to continue the messages, but he wondered if Lucas would ever reply back to him. The poltergeist activity also increased in the meanwhile, and the latest were these heavy, deliberate footsteps on the roof as if someone was walking on it. But whenever they run out to catch the person in the act, there would be no one on the roof. One afternoon, Deb fell asleep in front of the fire in the lounge, and she dreamt that she met Lucas in his own time. This woke her up immediately, and she felt the need to go to the bathroom. So she walked into the kitchen and opened the kitchen door, and there standing before her was Thomas, gazing at her. The vision only lasted for a few moments, but the next day, Ken found chalk marks on the kitchen wall. Lucas had left his name. Thomas is pacified by Ken's reply. He even goes on to reveal his true college's name, Brasenose College in Oxford. Now, Peter traveled to Brasenose to find the records of a Lucas Weinman there, but he couldn't. But then, on the other hand, the records were also not complete. Things were getting a little too complicated for Thomas, and he felt the need to confide in someone. So one day Thomas got on his horse and rode to Stockport to seek the counsel of a friend. But this meeting didn't go as well as Thomas had hoped for. The friend was concerned about Thomas's state of mind and asked him to promise that he wouldn't talk to the people of the future until he came and personally inspected the liens. When Thomas walked into his kitchen the next day, he found Debbie standing there by the fireplace looking bewildered. When he began to greet her, Catherine stood up in fright because she couldn't see Debbie. So Thomas pulled Debbie to the kitchen table and asked her to pick up the kitchen knife so that he could prove to Catherine that there was a person indeed here. But when Debbie reached for the kitchen knife, her hand passed through the kitchen table. This made Thomas angry, and he shouted at Catherine for not being able to see Debbie. Catherine got upset and began to cry and ran out of the house. This made Debbie angry, and she shouted at Thomas to stop being a jerk. But Thomas simply gestured her to walk back to her time. Debbie walked to the fireplace and woke up in her lounge in 1984. That evening, Thomas sent her a poem asking for her forgiveness for his behavior. But Debbie was getting more and more disturbed by these events. What was really happening with her? By this time, Deb and Ken have rented another house nearby to have some peace of mind, at least in the nights. In the meantime, Thomas's friend John arrives, and Thomas introduces him to Ken and Deb. In that conversation with John, Ken and Deb come to realize that Lucas was not his real name. No wonder they couldn't find any records of him anywhere. Now that Ken, Deb, and Peter were fairly certain that this was no hoax, they decided to call in the Society for Paranormal Research. But before the SPR people came in, the story took yet another bizarre turn. Thomas heard a knock on his door and wondered who was it at that time. When he opened the door, he found the sheriff, Thomas Foulshurst, standing there, and from his demeanor, Thomas understood that something was not right. Thomas was dragged from his cottage and thrown into a damp cellar. He was arrested for practicing witchcraft. Someone had betrayed Thomas. Ken and Deb were dismayed and alarmed to find that Thomas had been arrested from their friend John. John went so far as to accuse Ken and Deb for having caused this all mischief. and implored them to come out of the limbs and show themselves to the crown so that they may secure Thomas's release. Ken requested John to get the sheriff to the limbs and told him that it was not possible for them to travel to their time. He also said that he was willing to exchange any information to secure Thomas's release. Days later, Thomas finds himself dragged back again into the cottage and thrown into house arrest. He was demanded by the sheriff to extract information from the limbs while he awaited his death sentence. Thomas learns of Ken, Deb and Peter's efforts to save him and he is deeply moved by it. But in spite of their best efforts, Thomas was not saved. In one of his last goodbye messages, Thomas expresses surprise that Ken, Deb and Peter were from 1984 and not 2109 as he had thought. Ken gaped at the message. Why would Lucas assume that they were from 2109? Was someone else in touch with Lucas who were from 2109? Ken remembered the first message he ever received on his computer, which was titled Ken, Deb and Nick. That was the only piece of communication that didn't fit with the rest of the messages, and that was the only message that was not signed by Lucas. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Ken typed into his computer, calling 2109. And shortly they receive a message.
Ken, Deb, Peter. We are sorry that we can give you only two choices. That you either have your predicament explained in such a non-rhyme way that you may have instant understanding but cause what should not be to happen, or try to understand that you three have a purpose that shall in your lifetime changes the face of history. We, 2109, must not affect your thoughts directly, but give you some sort of guidance that will allow room for your own destiny. All we can say is that we are all part of the same God, whatever He, it is.
It's a hoax, they can't even spell. This was Ken's first reaction. He was so enraged by the communication that he even thought these were the real hoaxers. But he still had to save his friend Thomas from his death. Thomas knew that he couldn't finish his book in time, so he asked his friend Ken to finish the book for him. But he was also worried that after him, Catherine might be arrested for witchcraft. He left his final message in Latin. Not to go forward is to go backwards. In time of death, may God be with you, Lucas. The room became silent as Ken and Deb read this. Tears of rage and unhappiness welled up in Ken's eyes. There were no messages after that. Days passed in quiet routine. School, restorations to the cottage, silent drives on the country. Weeks passed, long and drawn out. Ken turned to 2109 for help, but as usual they spoke in riddles. John Bucknell and Dave Welch from the Society for Paranormal Research arrive and begin their investigations, but their first suspects are Ken, Deb and Peter. They bugged their whole kitchen and tried to listen to intruders, but on those days they were present for investigation, no messages would arrive from 2109. Meanwhile, Peter Trinder received a letter from Robin Peedle. Now, Robin Peedle was an assistant librarian at the Brasenose College who had initially helped Peter to hunt for Lucas's name in the records. Now, Robin Peedle had done his own investigations and had arrived at a name that seemed the most likely candidate for the real identity of Lucas. He proposed the name of Thomas Hawarden. Just when they thought they wouldn't hear from 1543 again, they got a message from the time. They heard from John, the friend of Lucas. He demanded that they make the power of limbs his. Angry and disappointed, Ken and Deb ignored his repeated messages. The poltergeist activity was back with a vengeance. One morning, Deb found a 6-foot-high pile of furniture pushed up against the kitchen door. Chairs, bicycle, a few tools, and even few tiles have been pulled up and stacked against the kitchen door. Inside the kitchen, everything has been moved out of place or twisted out of shape. Now, all those days, Deb was plagued by a repeated dream. In the dream, she found herself in a damp dungeon with the only sunlight streaming through a metal square grill set into the ceiling. And she found herself humming the same tune over and over. The next message from the past shocked Ken and Deb. It turns out that it was not John who had been messaging them all along, but it was the Sheriff Thomas Foulshurst who was after the power of the Leams. So he had dragged John in and forced him to communicate with Ken and Deb on his behalf. In a desperate plea, the sheriff even offered to exchange the real identity of Lucas for the power of Leams. The message that immediately followed after was a secret message sent from John without the knowledge of the sheriff. In it, he revealed to Ken and Deb that Lucas was still alive and was being kept in a dungeon. Ken, Deb and Peter's joy knew no bounds, but they still had to save Lucas from the sheriff. Eventually, a plan formed itself. Making use of Deb's dream, they described in detail to the sheriff Lucas's dungeon and the Lucas's laments in Latin. They told sheriff that they had all the power to know everything they wanted to know, and they could also damn his soul if Lucas was not released within the hour. It worked. An hour and a half later, it was Thomas who messaged them back.
My three true friends. Oh, I weep so much, wishing I could be with my friends again, even if only for a short time. It is painful that I cannot hold you to my breast, but must instead express such love for my friends through these words on the Leams. I know you to be as dear to me as my own kin, for before your time was joined to mine, I never knew friendship so true, though it has been over so many years of changes and we are all so confused. But I need words so that I may have your comfort. I must rest now so that I can speak with you tomorrow. Otherwise, I will make no sense with my words to my goodly friends. I need time to weep. Lucas.
Exhausted, Thomas dragged himself to his bed and collapsed into it. It took a few days for Thomas to regain his strength and his faith, but troubles were not over for him yet. A person by the name Richard Grosvenor visited him, asking him to sell his land to him. Eventually, Thomas was forced to make a deal, and he was given 2 months to vacate the place. With the departure of Thomas inevitable, Ken, Deb and Peter rushed to make the most of it. Now, Ken and Thomas suspect that 2109 was interfering with their communication. So Thomas suggested that they use paper instead of the computer, bypassing 2109. Ken or Deb would place a piece of paper and a piece of charcoal by the computer, and a few hours later they would find Thomas's handwritten messages on it. In these paper communications, Ken and Deb and Peter come to realize that most of the Thomas's initial messages have been edited or even doctored by 2109, and that was the reason for several inconsistencies in language and fact. Thomas finally revealed his name, and with this information, Peter was able to find out that Thomas indeed had been a Brasenose College fellow for 2 years and was expelled for expunging the name of Pope. But Thomas insisted that that was not the real reason. So after a couple of weeks of digging, Robin Peedle finds out the original document, and they find out that Thomas had been expelled for not crossing out the Pope's name. Thomas had retired to Dodleston in order to live through the Henrician Revolution. In the meanwhile, the Society of Paranormal Researchers people weren't finding much in their investigations, and John Bucknell brought in another person in place of Dave Welsh to continue with the investigations. All 2109 would offer them were endless riddles and a few coordinates for a star that they said would be important for the future of humanity. They also confirmed that they were from what the SPR people called a tachyon universe, but also said that the human understanding of tachyons was wrong. The entire communication suggested that 2109 may not be the year they were referring to, but just a name that they were using. They may not, after all, be from the year 2109. Another chilling development that happened with Thomas was that Catherine went missing. It had been 2 days since Catherine was missing, and Thomas was getting pretty upset. He had heard a rumor in the village that she had been burnt for practicing witchcraft. Peter tried to hunt for the records of witch burnings in the Chester for that year. He could not find any, but Thomas could not be consoled. He finally decided that he would go and hunt for her and would not return until he had found her. A couple of days later, he returns home and confirms to Ken, Deb, and Peter that Catherine had indeed been burned. Thomas is beside himself and he could not be consoled. He blamed himself for what happened to Catherine, and so did Ken. In the meantime, the SPR people found no evidence and gave up their search. In response to an article by a local newspaper, they say that it was their opinion that this was all a hoax and indirectly pointed fingers at Ken, Deb, and Peter for being responsible for all of this. Frustrated with this, Ken called up SPR to get a copy of the records of their investigation, but was surprised to find that no record had been submitted to them and that John Bucknell had gone missing. What astounded him even more was that the SPR had never heard of the other two people that John had brought along with him as members of SPR for the investigation. After a failed investigation by the SPR people, 2109 asked Ken to get in touch with a ufologist by the name Gary M. Rowe. Gary arrived with several equipments to conduct his own tests. 2109 began its conversation with Gary, but insisted that it be kept a secret. So Ken had no choice but to print out all of 2109's messages and put them into a sealed envelopes without reading them and delivered the envelope to Gary, to which Gary would in return give his own responses in another sealed envelope that Ken would place on the computer. Sometimes these envelopes disappeared from the kitchen. In one of the open messages, 2109 hinted to Gary that he was familiar with 2109's work in the past. Gary too revealed something interesting in one of his open replies.
Greetings. I am instructed to apologize, but in any event, I would have done so of my own volition. There will be a letter hopefully this weekend. I am also instructed to apologize to Ken and Debbie. I must try and answer your last letter. It would appear that you are more important than I had realized in the scheme of things. Gary.
Now, who had instructed Gary to apologize? Was it something to do with what happened in Canada? And what happened in Canada? These were all questions that Ken and Deb and Peter could not find out because Gary was as reticent as 2109 on these matters. Back in 1545, Thomas had only 4 days left, and he was quite burdened already by the loss of Catherine, and now having to leave his house and his friends was unbearable for him. But he had a mission to fulfill. He wanted to finish the book, and that was his life purpose now. His last few messages were filled with pain and sadness. When the final day arrived, Ken tried to avoid the goodbye by staying away from the cottage, but he could not. He came back to the cottage to find Lucas's last message. Here's a part of that message.
My true fellows and sweet maid, Grosvenor has said Thomas must go. I know it is for the best because the people of Dodleston are very wary of me. Grosvenor says they will burn my old farm down, and except for him, all the village despises me. At least that is his view. It is good that all will change and there are true men to follow like Ken and Peter, though 400 years is a long time and there is much to happen to mankind. It is sad that men must learn righteousness from their ugly ways, believing that they have to look for truth in ruthlessness and never follow a path that is for truth. I pray for my fellows at night that they are never imprisoned because of their love for their brother Thomas. I know I mustn't sorrow for I cannot put these feelings to paper, but you must know that I weep and am emotional. I find it hard to write. Perhaps you will come to Oxford. Now I think there is no danger for me there. for I hear the king is very sick, and all is quiet in the church. I will write my book about my brothers and maid, and of the end of Lucas, of our love for each other. One day you will all sit at my table for wine and meat by the river in Oxford, where we shall read each other's books and laugh, and we shall speak of truth and good men, watching Oxford change together forevermore. In your time my book is old, but I shall not go to my God until it is written, then we will all be truly embraced. My love to you all. I shall await you in Oxford. Thomas Harden.
And then 2109 sent their last message. Here's a part of their message.
Ken, Deb, Peter, faith must not be lost. You all rely on each other's faith. There is another person to come. They will be the help we need, and you will know them when they come. Thomas did eventually write his book and soon died shortly after. He placed it in a secure place. It shouldn't take too many years to find it. Though he wrote it in Latin with the help of a friend that he met in Oxford, the inscription reads, I write this in hope that my fellows will one day find this book. Then may our lands be not so distant. We will finish, now you have a lot of work to do. There is no need for you to write back, as we will have gone. Thank you for your cooperation. 2109.
Ken Webster published his experiences in a book, The Vertical Plane, in 1989. A second edition was published in 2022 with some added messages and new thoughts by the author. Now, before we go into analyzing whether this story was real or not, a short disclaimer from me. I have dramatized certain scenes of Thomas, but I have not fabricated any details. I've just stuck to the facts stated in the book, but I've just chosen to work from the premise that Thomas was real, that he was a real person who experienced the pain, the fear, the loss, and the sadness that Ken and Deb had gone through in these experiences. I just wanted to see how it felt to be in Thomas's shoes for once. So what do you think of this story? Do you think this really happened? Or do you think this was a hoax? If this was a hoax, the first suspects would be Ken and Deb, naturally. Maybe they started this whole thing as a prank on Nick, or a harmless prank on Peter, to see how quickly they would get caught by an English scholar because of their poor knowledge of the 15th century English. And perhaps then it went too far and became too good that they wanted to make a buck out of this and publish a book. If that was true, it means that there was no poltergeist activity or there were no messages at all. None of this really happened. Everything was fabricated out of thin air, and it's just that the whole prank was carried out for 18-month period before Ken decided that this would make a good book too and make some money out of this. But that also means that Ken and Deb must have possessed an extensive knowledge of the early modern English or some resources that gave them guidance on how to write such messages. That one thing that did bother me while reading the book was the way the whole story unfolded. It felt for me as if the later part of the book was trying to plug the holes of logic that the earlier chapters have left. For instance, how would someone from 1541 know about a Jesus college that would not be built until much later on? Unless it was a coincidence that Thomas came up with the name and such a college did happen to come up later on. Similarly, Kinnerton Hall. Of course, Thomas later on claimed that this was a lie he had put in there to test Ken and Deb to see if they were really from the future. So he could have totally made up the Kinnerton Hall thing. And then the later Kinnerton Hall did really come up just like Jesus' college. And it wouldn't be much of a stretch of logic to consider that because there were lower and upper Kinnerton even in Thomas's period in the 16th century. Also the name Thomas Harden. Thomas did not reveal his name until after Robin Peedle suggested this name to Ken and Deb and Peter. It did seem to me at times that the later half of the story was getting much more refined and historically accurate than the earlier part, as if someone was improvising as they went. But then, on the other hand, it could also be because Ken was not a professional writer. This was his first book ever. And because of the stress, the 2 years that had put them through, the emotional turmoil and the stress they had gone through, because of this whole event actually happening to them. Now, what really made me lean towards the theory that this might be real and not a hoax was what had happened subsequently after the book was published, or rather, what had not happened after the book was published. You see, if I was such a hoaxer and had pulled off a brilliant hoax across a 2-year period and put the effort to write it down into a book, I would be out there selling the book in any way possible, right? I mean, I put my career as a respectable teacher and an economics consultant for small businesses on the line in order to make a sensation out of this and make some quick buck out of this whole thing. I would be out there in every speech, every documentary, every club, every book club, paranormal club, anywhere there is an audience that is willing to listen to me or where I can sell my book. But that's what Ken and Deb did not do. Why? From what research I did out there, I found the sales of the book to be quite bleak. Sure, people are showing more interest in it now, but back then it was largely ridiculed and panned. So Ken and Deb did appear in one documentary made by BBC and a few press releases, yes, but in that BBC documentary, they sat with their backs to the camera. Only Peter Trinder would show his face. Why would anyone want to do that if they pulled off a hoax and published a book and wanted to sell it? Now, it's also nearly impossible for them to have pulled off this whole prank without the knowledge of at least some of their family and friends. Deb's mother and brother, for instance, were present when some of these activities happened, and so they had to be in on it. Peter Trinder, of course. Then there's Frank Davies, the mechanics teacher, Val Trinder, Dave Cummins, and Robin Peedle, just to name a few. And to think that none of them have come forward in all these years to debunk the whole affair. Now, coming to the second possibility that Ken and Deb have been victims of a hoax, and eventually Peter too. Now, remember that there were at least 300 messages that they had received over a period of 2 years. Now, for someone to have snuck into their house 300 times, to have written messages in computer, handwritten, on the walls, when they were not in the house, when they were in the house, it seems that there has to be a lot of luck on their side for this to have happened, not to mention their extensive knowledge of early modern English. And they would also have to orchestrate the poltergeist activities without arousing any suspicion. Do you think that can be done? Not me. Now, Lewis Sinclair, in his channel, Lewis Sinclair Investigates, has done an 8-part in-depth series on this whole Dodleston affair. He gives an in-depth analysis about the language that Thomas Hawarden had been using in his time, and to debunk the theory that this was a hoax. For anyone who wants to dig deeper, I would suggest you check out his channel. I've left the link in the description. Of course, I would suggest that you begin with the book in the first place, and I've left a link to that in the description too. Now, there was also someone on the YouTube who suggested what the SPR people had initially suggested, that the BBC microprocessor had been hacked. Now, remember, this was 1984, not the days of internet. At least not internet for the widespread public use. So it meant that each of this microprocessor had to be rigged physically in order for it to transmit any kind of messages wirelessly or with wire out of the house. And what do I mean by every one of the computers? So you see, every time Ken borrowed a microprocessor from the school, it wouldn't be a guarantee that it was the same processor that he had in his home before. It meant that all of the microprocessors that the school had to be rigged, and also the computer that Ken eventually bought had to be rigged too. For me, that seems like stretching the logic thin by someone who is not willing to accept the other possibility that this could be real. Now, what if this really happened? Now, it would mean two things for me. One, that Thomas Hawarden had actually lived there and experienced some sort of communication with beings of the future, as hard it might be for Thomas to have believed in the beginning. And two, that there is a book out there that is yet to be found that is written by Thomas Hawarden. But the most unsettling aspect for me would be that there is an entity or a body of entities calling themselves 2109 out there somewhere that can facilitate a communication across time. And that this book is the evidence that they have done it at least once. Well, at least twice, actually. Well, I forgot to mention that in the book, Ken writes that 2 years after this whole affair, around July 1987, a couple got in touch with him, a couple from Luxembourg got in touch with him and told him that an entity calling itself 2105 had asked them to get in touch with Ken. Just the way that 2109 had directed Ken to get in touch with Gary M. Rowe, the ufologist, remember? As for the other question, that is there any evidence of Thomas Hawarden having lived in the 16th century? Well, there is of course the record of Thomas Hawarden being in the Brasenose College, but that apart, I was not able to find out any pinpointed evidence. Sure, there were a few records of certain Thomas Hawardens having lived around and in the Dodleston area in the past, but I was not able to ascertain that it was indeed this Thomas Hawarden. I found ample evidence of the Sheriff Thomas Foulshurst having lived in that time period. In fact, he was made the sheriff in the year 1528 for the whole county. Thomas Foulshurst was later knighted, probably on 31st May 1533, just a day before Queen Anne Boleyn's coronation. I also found a few other records of him, including a court case in which he was alleged of a land grabbing by a neighbor. Thomas Foulshurst also went on to write the Code of Regulations for the town of Nantwich. He died in the year 1558. Coming to Gary M. Rowe, it was assumed that he was missing for a long while, but he has resurfaced some time ago. And there is an interview on YouTube of him discussing about the Dodleston case. Though he doesn't reveal much about what happened between him and 2109, he discusses the ingenious method by which he ascertained that his envelopes were not being tampered with. But who or what are 2109? Are they some sort of alien beings from a distant planet or a different dimension altogether? Or is it some sort of an advanced AI, as some suggest? Or are they a bunch of humans from the future in the year 2109? And why would 2109 conduct this experiment? What was it trying to learn? On one hand, it does make sense that they opened up a portal to study human beings if 2109 were some alien beings. If they are humans from the year 2109, what are they trying to achieve? Were they trying to alter the past in some way? Now also remember that there was a mention of tachyon universe, and tachyon, as of our current understanding now, or at least from what I understood on reading up online, seems to be particles that go faster than the speed of light. So by being someone from a tachyon universe, does it mean that 2109 does not have a concept of time at all? And all of this, the past, present and future, are happening at the same time. Is 2109 still around? If I was to go onto my computer now and type calling 2109, would I get any response? No, I didn't. I tried. But I don't think so. I didn't expect to. I think that the communication at that point was possible because there was a portal of some sort open through which the communication across time and space had been made possible. That communication portal was either opened by 2109 or it might have been opened by the act of digging up the foundations of the Meadow Cottage. So I believe that unless a communication portal has been opened in the first place, none of us will be able to get in touch with 2109. Do you want to try it and see? I don't recommend you to. Eventually, there are only two ways that all of this can be proven true. One is by someone finding Thomas's book from the past. Or two is by 2109 starting another experiment and another portal in the future. Perhaps it will be you. Perhaps your phone will ping or your glasses will pop a message and you will be able to get a glimpse of the past, or maybe even get a glimpse of the world of 2109. Who knows? Only time can tell. Yeah, I'll see you then. I've left some links in the description. Check them out if you want to dig deeper into all of this. Until I see you again, this is Deadmanswill.